October 15, 1932. Agent Vincent Morrison crouched behind a steel door in Al Capone's Safehouse basement, listening to his partner Tommy scream as something tore him apart in the next room. The screaming stopped after 47 seconds. Vinny pressed his service revolver against his temple. One bullet left. He could end it quick. Instead, he stayed hidden for 3 hours until the rescue team arrived. 5 agents in bureau suits, led by a man whose voice Vinny recognized but couldn't place. They found 7 dead agents. They found Tommy's body carved open like a medical textbook. They found evidence that would bury Capone forever. What they didn't find was the truth about who sent them there. For 37 years, Vinnie Morrison kept that secret. Until yesterday, when someone mailed him Tommy's badge with a note, "We know you heard everything." The night that made Hoover's career wasn't about catching Capone. It was about silencing the only men who knew what the director really was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The package had arrived with yesterday's mail, nestled between a grocery store circular and his granddaughter's birthday invitation like a severed finger in a bouquet. Vincent Morrison, though he'd been Vincent Murphy for longer than he'd been Morrison, stood at his kitchen window, watching October snow dust his Wisconsin pines while Tommy Kellerman's badge burned cold in his palm. 37 years of careful anonymity. 37 years of teaching high school history, coaching baseball, attending church suppers where nobody asked about his past because everyone assumed he'd always been the quiet widower who fixed their tractors and minded his own business. 37 years of waking up screaming Tommy's name until his late wife Sarah learned to shake him awake before the neighbors heard. The badge was real. He'd memorized every scratch during those 3 hours of hiding, including the gouge where Tommy's fingernail had carved a desperate line across the brass when whatever they'd sent into that room started cutting. Vinny's coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he kept gripping the mug because his hands needed something to hold besides his service revolver. The gun sat locked in his bedroom safe, where it had remained untouched since 1932, but muscle memory made his fingers twitch toward his hip every few minutes. The note had been typed on bureau letterhead, ancient letterhead, from before they'd changed the seal. Someone had kept official stationery for 4 decades just to deliver this message. Someone who knew he was alive, knew where he lived, knew his daughter Emma was driving up from Milwaukee this weekend with little Sophie to celebrate the girl's 7th birthday. "We know you heard everything." Through his kitchen window, Vinny watched the mailman's truck disappear down the county road. Harold Griggs had been delivering mail to Murphy Farm for 15 years, and he'd never once brought anything that could destroy a man's life. But then, most men hadn't spent 40 years listening for footsteps that would announce the arrival of their past. Vinny had heard everything that night, every word of the conversation that took place after the rescue team found the bodies. 5 men in bureau suits discussing cleanup protocols, evidence removal, and acceptable casualty reports. 5 men whose voices he'd recognized but whose faces he'd never seen, hidden as he was behind that steel door with Tommy's blood seeping under the gap. The man in charge had possessed a distinctive voice, nasal, precise, with the cadence of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Vinny had spent months afterward listening to radio broadcasts of Director Hoover's speeches, comparing inflections and pronunciations, until he'd convinced himself he was imagining similarities. Because the alternative was impossible. The alternative was that J. Edgar Hoover had personally supervised the murder of 7 federal agents. But the badge proved otherwise. Tommy's badge, which should have been buried with him in Arlington National Cemetery, was sitting on Vinny's kitchen table beside a note written on letterhead that hadn't existed since 1935. Someone wanted him to remember. Someone wanted him to understand that his survival hadn't been luck or cowardice or divine intervention. His survival had been deliberate, orchestrated. They'd needed one witness to live long enough to file the official report, and they'd chosen the rookie who'd frozen like a deer in headlights while his partner died screaming. The phone rang. Vinny stared at it for 4 rings before lifting the receiver. "Mr. Murphy?" The voice belonged to Emma, and she sounded worried. "Dad, are you there?" "I'm here, sweetheart." "You sound strange. Are you feeling all right? Do you need me to come up early?" Vinny closed his eyes. His daughter had inherited Sarah's intuition and her mother's stubborn need to fix broken things. She'd spent the last 5 years trying to fix him, bringing Sophie for weekend visits and holiday dinners, slowly rebuilding the relationship that his nightmares and paranoia had fractured when she was growing up. "I'm fine," he lied, "just tired. Looking forward to seeing you both tomorrow. Sophie's been asking about the birthday surprise you promised. She's convinced you're getting her a pony. Not quite that big." Vinny forced warmth into his voice while staring at the badge. "But she'll like it." They talked for another 5 minutes about Emma's work at the hospital, about Sophie's struggles with second-grade math, about ordinary life problems that belonged to people who hadn't spent 4 decades hiding from their own government. When Emma finally hung up, Vinny realized his hands were shaking. They knew about Emma. They had to know about Sophie. Men who could locate a federal agent who'd been dead on paper since 1932 wouldn't have trouble tracking down his family. "We know you heard everything." The question wasn't what they knew. The question was what they wanted him to do about it. Outside, snow continued falling on the farm where Vincent Murphy had built a quiet life on the bones of Vincent Morrison's secrets. Tomorrow, his daughter and granddaughter would drive up that long gravel driveway expecting birthday cake and family stories. Tonight, Vinny had to decide whether to run or fight or simply wait for whatever came next. The badge grew heavier in his palm, carrying the weight of 7 dead men and 1 living coward who'd somehow become their only hope for justice. What happens when Vinny's past collides with his present? Make sure you're following along. Tomorrow we dive deeper into the night that changed everything, and I promise you won't see the next twist coming. Vinny set Tommy's badge on the kitchen table and walked through his house like a man inventorying his life. 40 years of careful construction spread before him, the oak floors he'd refinished himself, the stone fireplace where Emma had opened Christmas presents, the family photographs arranged on shelves like evidence of normalcy. Sarah smiled from their wedding portrait, her hand resting on his arm, unaware she was marrying a ghost. In Sophie's room, the spare bedroom he'd painted yellow with dancing bears after Emma announced her pregnancy, everything waited for tomorrow's visit. New crayons in a mason jar, picture books stacked on the nightstand, a half-finished dollhouse he'd been building in his workshop, each tiny shingle cut and placed with the patience of a man who understood that love lived in details. The dollhouse was supposed to be her birthday surprise. 6 months of measuring and sanding and painting, creating something beautiful from scratch, because that's what grandfathers did. Normal grandfathers who didn't keep service revolvers locked in bedroom safes. Normal grandfathers whose past didn't arrive in packages with 40-year-old letterhead. Vinny touched the dollhouse's miniature front door. His hands, weathered from decades of farm work and teaching, had grown steady again. Building things calmed him. Always had, even before that night when everything he'd built for himself, his career, his sense of purpose, his faith in the bureau, had crumbled into screaming and blood. The house settled around him with familiar sounds. Furnace cycling on, wind rattling windows. The grandfather clock Sarah had inherited from her mother, still keeping time in the hallway where she'd wound it every Sunday morning before church. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary life that belonged to Vincent Murphy, high school history teacher and part-time handyman, not Vincent Morrison, federal agent and witness to unspeakable things. But Morrison was bleeding through tonight, the way he always did when Vinny's defenses cracked. Morrison noticed that the oak floors would amplify footsteps, that the house had too many windows to defend, that running would mean abandoning everything Sophie associated with safety and love. Morrison cataloged escape routes while Murphy arranged birthday presents. From the kitchen came the soft hum of the refrigerator, where Emma's favorite chocolate cake waited under plastic wrap. Vinny had made it from Sarah's recipe, the same one they'd used for Emma's birthdays when she was Sophie's age, back when nightmares made him pace the halls at 3 in the morning while his wife and daughter slept. He'd been a terrible father then, distant, suspicious, jumping at shadows that might have been bureau assassins but were usually just tree branches or delivery trucks. Emma had forgiven him. Somehow, impossibly, she'd grown into a woman who brought her daughter to this remote farm every few weeks, rebuilding the family that Vinny's paranoia had fractured. She'd never asked why they'd moved to Wisconsin when she was 12. why her father had changed jobs and started looking over his shoulder at grocery stores. She'd simply accepted Vincent Murphy as an improvement over the hollow-eyed man who'd raised her in Illinois. Now, that careful reconstruction hung in the balance. The badge on his kitchen table represented more than personal danger. It represented the end of Sophie's weekend visits, Emma's patient forgiveness, the quiet life where Vinny could pretend his hands had built barns instead of typed death reports. Through the living room window, he watched snow accumulate on the gravel driveway where Emma's car would appear tomorrow afternoon. Sophie would burst from the passenger seat with 7-year-old energy, demanding to see her surprise and feed the chickens and hear the story about the raccoon family that lived in the old oak tree. Stories that belonged to Vincent Murphy, not Vincent Morrison. Morrison had never told bedtime stories. Morrison had spent 1932 learning how to disappear, how to create false identities, how to sleep with one hand near a weapon. Morrison had written his own death certificate and buried it in bureau files before fleeing to Wisconsin with a pregnant wife who'd asked no questions because she'd seen something die in his eyes. The phone rang again. Vinny stared at it, wondering if Emma's intuition had sharpened, if she'd somehow sensed that danger was circling their carefully maintained peace. But when he answered, silence greeted him. Not empty silence, the kind filled with controlled breathing and deliberate patience. "Vincent Morrison," a voice finally said, nasal, precise, with the cadence of command. The same voice that had supervised cleanup in Al Capone's Safehouse while Vinny bled and hid and listened to his partner's body being moved. Vinny's grip tightened on the receiver. Wrong number. "Tomorrow, your granddaughter turns 7. Your daughter drives a blue Honda Accord, license plate beginning with 847. She stops for gas at the Shell station outside Minocqua." The voice paused. "We know you heard everything, Agent Morrison. Now it's time to talk." The line went dead. Outside, snow continued falling on Murphy Farm, where a man who'd spent 40 years learning to love again discovered that some ghosts refuse to stay buried. Vinny stood frozen in his kitchen, the dead receiver humming in his hand like a live wire. The voice echoed in his skull, nasal, precise, carrying the authority of someone who'd never doubted their right to destroy lives. The same voice that had calmly discussed body disposal while Tommy's blood pooled under a steel door. After 40 years, they'd found him. After 4 decades of Vincent Murphy teaching American history to farm kids who called him Gramps and fixed his tractor without being asked, Vincent Morrison was back. His hands moved without conscious thought, muscle memory older than his marriage to Sarah. Deadbolt, chain lock, kitchen drawer where he kept the tactical flashlight he'd never needed. The Remington 870 from the hall closet, checked and loaded with movements precise as prayer. Bureau training died hard, even when the Bureau wanted you dead. The house transformed around him. Murphy's cozy kitchen became Morrison's defensive position. Too many windows, inadequate sightlines, the oak table providing minimal cover. The cheerful yellow walls seemed to mock his paranoia, but paranoia had kept him alive when 7 better agents died screaming. Tommy's badge caught the overhead light, winking from the table where Sophie would eat birthday cake tomorrow. If there was a tomorrow. If Emma's blue Honda made it past that Shell station without unmarked cars boxing her in. License plate, beginning with 847. They'd done their homework, knew Emma's routines, her route from Milwaukee, probably her work schedule at the hospital, knew Sophie's school, her teacher's name, which playground she favored. Professional surveillance, the kind that required resources and time and official authorization. The phone rang again. Vinny let it ring twice, 3 times, finger on the shotgun's safety. "Vincent." The same voice, patient as cancer. "We can do this the easy way. What do you want?" His voice sounded steadier than his hands felt. A conversation. "Tomorrow night, after your family leaves. Al Capone's old warehouse on South Ashland. You remember the address?" The warehouse. Not the safe house where Tommy died. The public front operation 3 blocks away, where bureau photographers had staged evidence photos for the newspapers. Where J. Edgar Hoover had stood before flashbulbs, announcing the successful raid that made his career. "I was never at any warehouse," Vinny said. "You were at the safe house." behind the steel door with the broken lock, bleeding from shrapnel, listening to clean-up protocols. The voice carried casual menace, like discussing weather. "We have recordings from that night, Vincent. Your breathing, your partner's final words, your whimpering." Heat flooded Vinny's face, shame older than his daughter's life, festering for 4 decades in silence. Tommy had called his name at the end, 3 desperate syllables while something carved him apart 20 feet away. Vinny had pressed his mouth against his sleeve to muffle his own terror. "The warehouse," the voice continued. 10 p.m. Come alone, or your granddaughter starts getting birthday cards from very dangerous people. The line went dead again. Vinny set down the phone and stared at his reflection in the kitchen window. 78-year-old face mapped with worry lines, white hair thinning, shoulders bent from decades of teaching and farming. Vincent Murphy, who'd never hurt anyone, who'd spent 40 years building instead of destroying. But Vincent Morrison stared back from the glass, younger, sharper, carrying the weight of unfinished business. Morrison remembered the layout of Capone's Safehouse, the smell of blood on concrete, the precise sound Tommy's fingernails made scraping brass. Morrison had spent 4 decades preparing for this phone call. From Sophie's room came the soft tick of the wind-up clock Sarah had bought for bedtime stories. Tick, 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 counting down to the moment Emma's car would pull into the driveway. Counting down to choices that would define whether Sophie grew up with a grandfather or a gravestone. Vinny walked to the dollhouse, running his fingers across the tiny shingles, each one placed with love, with hope that the future held birthday parties and Christmas mornings and ordinary grandfather moments, the kind of future that men like Morrison weren't allowed to keep. But Vincent Murphy had earned that future, had paid for it with 40 years of teaching children about democracy and justice and the importance of standing up to bullies, had built it from nothing but determination and Sarah's unwavering faith that good men could be redeemed. The badge seemed heavier now, pulling at the kitchen table like a gravitational force. Tommy's badge, waiting 40 years for justice or vengeance, or simply acknowledgement that 7 good men had died for J. Edgar Hoover's secrets. Outside, snow continued falling on Murphy Farm, covering the peaceful world Vincent Murphy had constructed over Vincent Morrison's bones. Tomorrow, that world would face its final test. Tonight, Vinny had to decide whether the man who'd hidden like a coward could become the man who'd fight like a father. The decision came at dawn, crystallizing like frost on the farmhouse windows. Vinny had spent the night walking circuits through his house, checking locks that couldn't keep out the past, adjusting curtains that wouldn't hide him from men who'd spent 40 years watching. By the time pale light crept across the snow-covered fields, Vincent Murphy was already losing his battle against Vincent Morrison. He called Emma at 7:30, his voice steady as concrete. "Sweetheart, I need to postpone Sophie's visit." "What? Dad, we're already packed. Sophie's been awake since 6, asking when we're leaving." Emma's concern sharpened. "Are you sick? Do you need me to drive up alone?" "Just a small emergency. Neighbor's barn collapsed in the snow. I need to help with the animals." The lie came easier than he'd expected. 40 years of practice. "We'll reschedule for next weekend." Silence stretched across the line. Emma had inherited her mother's ability to hear the spaces between words, to sense when men were protecting her from truths they couldn't speak. "Dad? Tell Sophie I'll make it up to her. Double birthday celebration." He forced warmth into his voice. "I love you both." Before Emma could probe deeper, he hung up and immediately dialed information. Chicago Police, Detective Division. The desk sergeant who answered sounded young, efficient, probably born after 1932, after the night that defined Vinny's life. "Detective Bureau. I need to speak with Detective Ray Kowalski. Tell him it's about the Capone warehouse job." "Sir, Detective Kowalski retired in 1967. He passed away, 15 years ago now. Dead." Another link to that night severed. Vinny had hoped Ray might remember something, might have kept files or photographs that could explain why voices from a 40-year-old massacre were making phone calls. But the grave had claimed Ray like it had claimed Sarah, like it would claim Vinny before this finished. He tried 3 more names from his mental list, 2 more deaths, one transfer to Miami in 1958. The Chicago Police Department had no institutional memory of Al Capone's final days. No records of the federal raid that had ended with 7 body bags and one terrified rookie writing sanitized reports. By afternoon, Vinny had exhausted every official channel. No one remembered the warehouse. No one had preserved evidence. The Bureau had scrubbed the operation from history so thoroughly that it might never have happened, except for Tommy's badge, still warm from being carried in someone's pocket for 4 decades, except for voices that shouldn't exist, making threats that proved someone had been listening to his careful life. The phone rang at 4:30. Vinny answered on the first ring. "Change of plans," the familiar voice said. "The warehouse is compromised. New location, the old Biograph Theater. You know where?" Vinny's blood chilled. The Biograph, where John Dillinger had died under FBI guns in 1934, where J. Edgar Hoover had orchestrated another public relations victory built on bullets and blood. That's a public place. Not anymore. Condemned since 1982. Perfect for private conversations. The voice carried satisfaction. 10 p.m., come through the alley entrance. And Vincent, don't disappoint us again. Again. As if his survival had been their first disappointment, his 4 decades of hiding their second. The line went dead, leaving Vinny alone with the understanding that this had always been inevitable. Men who'd killed 7 federal agents wouldn't leave witnesses alive indefinitely. They'd simply waited until Vincent Murphy had built something worth destroying, until threatening his family could guarantee his cooperation. He walked to his gun safe, hands steady despite the chaos in his chest. The .38 service revolver he'd carried the night Tommy died, cleaned and maintained but never fired in anger. Beside it, his bureau identification, the real one, not the forgeries he'd used to build Vincent Murphy's life. Vincent Morrison's badge, with a picture of a young man who'd believed in justice and duty and the righteousness of federal authority. That young man had died in Capone's Safehouse along with his partner. The man who'd crawled out had been something else entirely, harder, more cautious, capable of lies that lasted decades. Outside his window, the Murphy farm spread across rolling Wisconsin hills like a promise of peace. 40 years of careful cultivation, of crops and repairs and ordinary human kindness. Sarah's garden, dormant under snow but ready for spring. The chicken coop where Sophie scattered feed while giggling at the hens' fierce competition for corn. All of it built on bones that were finally coming home. Vinny holstered the .38 and pocketed Tommy's badge. Tonight, Vincent Morrison would walk into another trap. But this time, he wouldn't hide behind steel doors while good men died. This time, he'd face the voices that had haunted 40 years of nightmares, and finally learn why surviving had been his greatest mistake. The drive to Chicago unfolded like a pilgrimage in reverse, each mile carrying Vinny deeper into the man he'd spent 40 years trying to forget. The Wisconsin countryside gave way to Illinois suburbs, then to the sprawling decay of the South Side, where the Biograph Theater waited like a monument to unfinished business. He'd left Murphy Farm at 6, after feeding Sarah's chickens one last time. The simple act of scattering corn while snow dusted his shoulders felt like communion, a final blessing from the life he might never see again. The hens had followed their routine with oblivious contentment, pecking at kernels without understanding that their caretaker was driving toward his own execution. The radio played softly, classical music that Sarah had loved, that had filled their Sunday mornings with something approaching grace. Mozart's Requiem, appropriately enough. Vinny found himself humming along, his voice steadier than his hands on the steering wheel. At a truck stop outside Rockford, he'd made 2 calls, the first to his lawyer in Madison, authorizing the transfer of Murphy Farm to Emma's name. The second to Emma herself, leaving a voicemail that said only, "I love you and Sophie more than words. Remember that your old dad tried to be better than he was. Not quite a confession, not quite a goodbye, but close enough to both." The Biograph rose from North Lincoln like a tombstone, its Art Deco facade scarred by decades of Chicago weather. Plywood covered the marquee where movie titles had once promised escape. The alley entrance gaped black and uninviting, a mouth that had swallowed John Dillinger's last breath and was hungry for more. Vinny parked 3 blocks away, muscle memory dictating approaches and exit strategies. Morrison's training, surfacing after decades of dormancy. Check mirrors, note civilians, identify cover positions. The .38 rode heavy against his ribs, Tommy's badge a talisman in his pocket. Walking toward the theater, he passed landmarks that Morrison remembered but Murphy had never seen. The barber shop where Dillinger's girlfriend had betrayed him, the hot dog stand where federal agents had waited with Thompson guns, streets where J. Edgar Hoover had built his legend on corpses and newspaper headlines. The alley reeked of urine and decay. Broken glass crunched under Vinny's boots as he approached the stage door, which stood slightly ajar. No guards visible, no obvious surveillance. But Morrison recognized a killing ground when he saw one. Narrow walls, limited escape routes, perfect acoustics for screams that wouldn't carry to the street. Inside, the theater stretched before him like a cathedral dedicated to forgotten dreams. Velvet seats stripped of their cushions, chandelier crystals scattered across warped floors. The screen hung in tatters, silvered surface reflecting nothing but shadows. 3 figures waited on the stage, backlit by a single work light. 2 men in expensive overcoats, 1 woman in a burgundy suit that probably cost more than Murphy's annual teacher's salary. Professional posture, confident spacing, the kind of people who'd spent careers making problems disappear. Vincent Morrison. The woman spoke first, her voice carrying authority older than her apparent age. 50, maybe 55, with the bearing of someone who'd inherited power rather than earned it. You're remarkably well preserved for a dead man. Vinny walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the ruined acoustics. You have me confused with someone else. Do we? The shorter man stepped forward, revealing a face that Vinny almost recognized. Familiar bone structure, eyes set too close together. Tommy Kowalski was your partner, badge number 2847. He bled out while you hid behind a door like a frightened child. The words hit harder than physical blows. 40 years of guilt crystallized into rage so pure that Vinny's hand moved toward his weapon before conscious thought could stop it. Easy. The taller man's coat fell open, revealing a shoulder holster. We're here to talk, not to repeat old mistakes. What mistakes? Vinny's voice cracked like an adolescent's. 7 good men died that night. Tommy died calling my name. Tommy died because he saw something he shouldn't have seen, the woman said. Because he started asking questions about why J. Edgar Hoover needed Al Capone alive instead of dead. The theater's shadows seemed to shift around them. 40 years of assumptions crumbling, revealing something worse underneath. Capone was already dying, she continued. Syphilis, dementia, functionally useless to his organization, but very valuable to ours. He knew things, bank routes, political connections, the location of certain investments. Vinny's mouth went dry. You're saying the Bureau kept him alive? We're saying the Bureau had arrangements. Arrangements that your squad stumbled into during what was supposed to be a routine surveillance. The woman's smile carried no warmth. Tommy recorded everything on that wire he was wearing. Everything. Tommy's final words echoed across 40 years. Vinny, you hearing this? Jesus Christ, you getting this? Not a call for help. A desperate attempt to preserve evidence of something monstrous. The recording, Vinny whispered, still exists, along with 7 other voices that could destroy careers, topple administrations, rewrite the history of American law enforcement. The woman descended from the stage, each step deliberate as a countdown. Your silence bought you 40 years of peace, Vincent. But peace was never permanent. What do you want? The same thing we've always wanted. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough that he could see his own reflection in her eyes. Your cooperation. Or your granddaughter's understanding of why her grandfather was a coward. The threat hung in the stale air between them, but something in the woman's tone, too practiced, too rehearsed, triggered a memory that had been buried for 40 years. Vincent Morrison, the federal agent, suddenly remembered what Vincent Murphy, the frightened farmer, had forgotten. You weren't there that night, Vinny said quietly. The woman's confident smile flickered. What? You weren't there. None of you were. His voice grew stronger as pieces clicked into place. You're reading from files, reports, maybe recordings like you said, but you weren't in that safe house. The shorter man shifted uncomfortably. What difference does that make? It makes all the difference. Vinny pulled Tommy's badge from his pocket, watching their faces change as the metal caught the light. Because I was there. And I remember what really happened. The woman's composure cracked slightly. Vincent, you're confused, traumatized. It's understandable after… Tommy wasn't wired for sound that night, Vinny interrupted, his memory crystallizing like ice forming on a winter pond. The Bureau was too cheap for surveillance equipment in 1932. We had one camera between 12 agents and it was broken. Tommy was calling my name because he was scared, not because he was trying to preserve evidence. The taller man's hand moved closer to his weapon. You're misremembering. And there were no 7 voices, Vinny continued, his confidence building. Just screaming. Just gunfire. Just Al Capone's men executing federal agents who'd walked into an ambush. He stepped closer, studying their faces. You want to know what I really heard that night? What I've been too ashamed to admit for 40 years? The woman's professional mask was dissolving, revealing something desperate underneath. Vincent, stop! I heard myself, whimpering, praying, begging God to make Tommy stop calling my name because I was too terrified to help him. Vinny's voice cracked with 4 decades of suppressed emotion. There was no conspiracy, no secret recordings, no evidence of Bureau corruption, just a routine surveillance that went wrong and a coward who let his partner die. The theater fell silent except for the distant rumble of traffic on Lincoln Avenue. The 3 figures on the stage no longer looked like federal operatives or shadow government agents. They looked like what they were, desperate people who'd built their own elaborate fiction on the bones of his guilt. Who are you really? Vinny asked. The woman's shoulders sagged in defeat. Anna Kowalski, Tommy's granddaughter. The family resemblance became obvious now. Tommy's eyes, his stubborn jaw, the way he'd stood when he thought he was right about something. Vinny felt the world tilt sideways. Tommy never had children, he whispered. He had a son, born 8 months after he died. Anna's voice carried 40 years of inherited rage. My father grew up believing his dad was a hero who died fighting corruption, that the FBI covered up his murder to protect their dirty secrets. Because that's easier than the truth, the shorter man added. He had Tommy's nose, Vinny realized. Another grandchild, another keeper of manufactured legends. Easier than accepting that Uncle Tommy died for nothing, that there was no grand conspiracy, no noble cause, just bad luck and a partner who abandoned him. The elaborate fiction collapsed around them like the theater's crumbling ceiling. No shadow government, no secret recordings, no conspiracy spanning decades, just a family who couldn't accept that their patriarch had died in a meaningless ambush, who'd spent 40 years constructing a mythology grand enough to justify their loss. The badge, Vinny said. How did you get Tommy's badge? From evidence storage, Anna admitted. I work for the Bureau now, Records Division. When I found his file, when I saw your name listed as sole survivor, her voice hardened. I needed to know why you lived when he died. Because I hid, Vinny said simply. Because when the shooting started, I crawled behind a steel door and stayed there while Tommy called for help, because I was 23 years old and terrified and human. The admission should have destroyed him. Instead, it felt like absolution. You think that makes you a hero? Anna's composure cracked completely. You think admitting cowardice excuses 40 years of hiding? No, Vinny replied. But it makes me honest. Finally, he looked at Tommy's grandchildren, 2 strangers who'd inherited grief without context, rage without purpose. They'd spent decades believing in a lie because the truth was too small, too ordinary, too human to justify the magnitude of their loss. Your grandfather was a good man who died badly, Vinny said gently. That's not a conspiracy, it's just life. Anna's professional mask shattered completely, revealing the grieving granddaughter beneath. That's not enough. It can't be enough. But it is, Vinny said, understanding finally why he'd survived that night 40 years ago. It has to be. The silence stretched between them like a chasm 40 years wide. Anna Kowalski stood frozen in the theater's amber light, her grandfather's badge trembling in Vinny's weathered palm. The mythology she'd constructed, Federal conspiracies, secret recordings, noble deaths lay in ruins around her feet like the theater's broken chandelier crystals. "That's not enough," she whispered again, but the words carried less conviction now. "There has to be more. There has to be meaning." Vinny pocketed Tommy's badge and pulled out his cell phone. His arthritic fingers found Emma's number with muscle memory born of love and daily habit. "There is meaning, just not the kind you wanted. What are you doing?" The shorter man, Tommy's other grandchild, stepped forward nervously. "Calling my daughter." Vinny pressed dial before anyone could stop him. "Telling her the truth, all of it." Emma answered on the second ring. "Dad, where are you? Sophie's been asking—" "Emma, listen to me." Vinny's voice carried 40 years of accumulated courage. "My name isn't Vincent Murphy. It's Vincent Morrison, and I was an FBI agent in 1932. I've been hiding from something that happened a long time ago, but I'm done hiding now." "Dad, you're scaring me. Are you having some kind of episode?" Anna lunged for the phone, but Vinny stepped back, his movements surprisingly quick for a 68-year-old farmer. Morrison's reflexes, surfacing when they mattered most. "I let my partner die," he continued, watching Anna's face crumble. "I was young and scared, and when the shooting started, I hid like a coward while a good man bled out calling my name. I've lived with that shame for 40 years, but I won't let it define me anymore." "Vincent, stop," Anna pleaded. "If you tell the truth, there's no mystery left, no purpose. My father built his whole life around avenging Tommy's death." "Then your father built his life on a lie," Vinny said gently. "Just like I built mine." He turned back to the phone. "Emma, I know this doesn't make sense, but I need you to understand something. I failed when it mattered most, and that failure made me a better man. Made me worthy of your mother, worthy of you and Sophie. Dad, please come home. We can talk about this." "I am coming home. For the first time in 40 years, I'm actually coming home." He ended the call and looked at Tommy's grandchildren, seeing not threats but fellow travelers on grief's long road. "Your grandfather saved my life by dying." The taller man laughed bitterly. "That's convenient theology. It's honest theology." Vinny sat down in one of the theater's broken seats, suddenly feeling every one of his 68 years. "Tommy's death taught me that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing to act anyway. I spent 40 years learning that lesson." Anna sank into a seat across the aisle, her burgundy suit wrinkled, her professional composure completely abandoned. So there was no conspiracy, no cover-up, no secret worth killing for? "There was a cover-up," Vinny admitted. "Mine. I wrote reports that made Tommy sound heroic and myself competent. I buried the truth so deep I almost believed my own lies. But that was just shame, not conspiracy." The work light flickered, casting dancing shadows across the theater's ruins. Somewhere in the building, pipes groaned with the weight of decades and neglect. The biograph was dying the same death as their manufactured mysteries, slowly, inevitably, returning to dust. "What happens now?" the shorter man asked. "We've spent years planning this confrontation, following you, learning your routines, building profiles of your family. What do we do with all that preparation?" "You go home," Vinny said simply. "You tell your families that Tommy Kowalski was a federal agent who died in the line of duty, that he was brave and dedicated and loved his job, that his death mattered because it mattered to the people who loved him." Anna was crying now, ugly tears that streaked her makeup and revealed the young woman beneath the federal agent's mask. "But he died for nothing. A random ambush, a routine surveillance gone wrong. Where's the justice in that?" "There isn't any," Vinny replied. "Justice is what we make afterward. Tommy's death gave me 40 years of trying to be worthy of his sacrifice. It gave your father a reason to believe in something larger than himself. It brought you into the bureau, where maybe you'll prevent other meaningless deaths." He stood slowly, joints protesting, and walked toward the alley exit. The dead don't need grand conspiracies to matter. They just need to be remembered honestly. Behind him, Anna's sobs echoed in the empty theater. Not the tears of an avenging granddaughter whose quest had ended in disappointment, but the grief of a woman finally mourning a grandfather she'd never had the chance to know as simply human. Vinny stepped into the Chicago night. breathing free air for the first time in 40 years. The Chicago night air cut through Vinny's lungs like absolution, each breath washing away decades of accumulated lies. He'd made it 3 blocks from the biograph when footsteps echoed behind him, quick, desperate, catching up. "Wait." Anna's voice cracked like thin ice. "Please, just wait." Vinny turned to find her standing under a streetlight. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, the federal agent's composure completely stripped away. She looked younger now, vulnerable in a way that reminded him painfully of Emma at that age, lost, angry, searching for something solid to stand on. "What happens to us?" she asked. "To my father? He spent 40 years believing in a lie. Then maybe it's time he learned the truth," Vinny said gently. "Maybe it's time you both did." Anna laughed bitterly. "You don't understand. Dad's whole identity is built around being Tommy Kowalski's son, the man who died fighting corruption. He named me after Anna Sage, the woman who betrayed Dillinger. He taught me to shoot using Tommy's service weapon. Every bedtime story was about justice and sacrifice and—" Her voice broke completely. "What do I tell him?" Vinny studied her face in the streetlight's harsh glow, seeing Tommy's stubborn jaw, his intensity, but also something Tommy had never possessed, a capacity for doubt that might save her from the certainty that had destroyed them both. "You tell him his father was human," Vinny said. "You tell him Tommy was scared that night too, but he went into that safe house anyway because it was his job. That's not mythology. That's courage. But you said—" "I said I was a coward. I never said Tommy wasn't brave." The distinction felt important, necessary. He could have run when the shooting started. Instead, he called for backup, called for me. That's not the action of a man thinking about conspiracy theories or secret recordings. That's a cop trying to survive and hoping his partner would help. Anna's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. Behind them, Chicago's nighttime symphony played on. Distant sirens, late buses, the eternal urban lullaby that had soundtrack to Tommy's death and Vinny's rebirth. "I've been so angry," she whispered, "for so long. At you, at the Bureau, at everyone who survived when he didn't." "I know," Vinny said. "I was angry too. At myself mostly, but anger finds targets wherever it can." She looked up at him then, and he saw the moment when the avenging granddaughter finally stepped aside to make room for the grieving woman. How do you stop? How do you let go of that much rage? "You don't let go," Vinny replied, thinking of Emma's laugh, Sophie's small hand in his, the weight of honest earth under a farmer's boots. "You transform it, channel it into something that builds instead of destroys." A taxi rounded the corner, its headlights sweeping across them before disappearing into the urban darkness. The moment felt suspended, balanced on the knife's edge between past and future. "I destroyed my career tonight," Anna said suddenly, "accessing those files, using Bureau resources for personal vendettas. When this comes out, then you'll find another career, one built on who you really are instead of who you thought you had to be." Vinny pulled out his phone again, scrolling to Emma's number. "I need to call my daughter back, need to finish what I started in there." Anna nodded, understanding somehow that this was goodbye. "Will you tell her about Tommy? About what really happened?" "I'll tell her about courage," Vinny said, "about how good people can make terrible choices and still find redemption, about how the dead deserve honest grief instead of manufactured glory." She turned to go, then stopped. "Morrison, Vincent, do you really think Tommy's death mattered?" Vinny thought about the question seriously, measuring his words against 40 years of accumulated wisdom. Tommy's death mattered because he mattered. To your father, to you, to me. But not because of some grand conspiracy or noble sacrifice, because he was a decent man who tried to do his job and died too young. Anna nodded slowly, processing this smaller, more human truth. "That's going to have to be enough, isn't it?" "It's going to have to be everything," Vinny replied. She walked away then, her heels clicking against concrete in a rhythm that reminded him of rain on Murphy Farm's metal roof. He watched until she disappeared into the Chicago night, carrying her grandfather's memory toward whatever came next. Vinny pressed Emma's number and lifted the phone to his ear. When she answered, her voice tight with worry and confusion, he took a breath that tasted like freedom. "Sweetheart," he said, "let me tell you about the night I became your father." "Dad, what are you talking about?" Emma's voice carried the particular strain of an adult child watching a parent unravel. "You're Vincent Murphy. You've always been Vincent Murphy." Vinny closed his eyes, seeing the farm's kitchen window lit against Wisconsin darkness. Sophie probably asleep upstairs clutching the stuffed rabbit he'd bought her for Christmas. Home felt both impossibly distant and close enough to touch. "No, sweetheart. I became Vincent Murphy the day I met your mother. But I was born Vincent Morrison, and that man died in a Chicago safehouse on October 15th, 1932. The line went quiet except for Emma's breathing and the faint sound of dishes being moved. Nervous energy, the same way she'd cleaned when her mother was dying. Finally, "Are you safe? Where are you?" "I'm safe. I'm in Chicago, standing where it all began." He looked up at the streetlight, watching moths dance their ancient spiral toward illumination and death. "Emma, I need you to listen to something that's going to sound impossible." For the next 20 minutes, Vinny told his daughter about Agent Morrison and Officer Kowalski, about blood on a safe house floor and 40 years of carried shame. He told her about manufactured conspiracies and inherited grief, about the difference between mythology and memory. Emma listened without interruption, her silence growing heavier as the story unfolded. When he finished, the night felt different somehow, thinner, as if the weight of secrets had been pressing down on Chicago itself. "Jesus, Dad." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "All these years, you've been carrying that alone?" "Not alone. I had your mother. Had you. That guilt, that shame. It made me understand how precious ordinary life really is. Made me worthy of love by teaching me how fragile it could be. But you could have told us. We would have understood." "Would you?" Vinny asked gently. "At 16, would you have understood that your father was a coward? That the man teaching you to drive, helping with homework, walking you down the aisle, that he'd failed when it mattered most?" Emma was crying now. He could hear it in her breathing. "You weren't a coward, Dad. You were 23 years old and terrified." "Same thing, sometimes." Vinny started walking toward the train station, each step carrying him further from Vincent Morrison's ghosts. "But I learned something tonight talking to Tommy's granddaughter. Courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about what you do with the fear afterward. What happens now? Do you have to go back to being Morrison?" The question hung in the night air like incense, heavy with implications. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed midnight, October 16th now, 40 years and 1 day since Tommy Kowalski died, calling for help that never came. "Vincent Morrison died in that safe house," Vinny said finally. "Vincent Murphy lived. Loved your mother, raised you, built something good from something terrible. I'm not changing my name back. I'm keeping the life that shame helped me earn. Will there be trouble? Legal issues? Probably not. The statute of limitations ran out decades ago, and there's no crime in being afraid. The only law I broke was against myself." He could see Union Station now, its neoclassical columns standing like sentries against the darkness. "I'll catch the morning train. Be home by dinner." "Dad?" Emma's voice carried the particular tenderness reserved for moments when the world reveals its fundamental fragility. "I'm proud of you. For surviving, for building the life you built, for finally telling the truth." "Your mother would have been proud too," Vinny said, and knew it was true. Margaret had always seen through his careful silences, had loved him despite sensing the shadows he carried. She knew there was something, but she never pushed. She was smart that way. Smarter than me, that's certain. The train station's waiting area was nearly empty. A few travelers dozing in plastic chairs, a janitor pushing a mop across marble floors that had absorbed a century of arrivals and departures. "Emma, I need you to help me tell Sophie. She's old enough to understand that people can carry sadness and still be good. We'll figure it out together." Vinny bought a ticket from the automated machine, his arthritic fingers steady now on the buttons. The 6:15 to Milwaukee would connect to the local line that stopped in Beaver Dam, then the county bus to Murphy Farm. A journey Vincent Morrison had taken in reverse 40 years ago, fleeing toward a future he couldn't have imagined. "I love you, sweetheart," he said. "Tell Sophie her grandpa's coming home." After Emma hung up, Vinny sat in the waiting area's fluorescent silence and pulled Tommy's badge from his pocket one final time. The metal was warm now, shaped by his palm during the long night's revelations. Tomorrow, he'd mail it to Anna Kowalski with a letter explaining that some inheritances were too heavy to carry alone. But tonight, he simply held it, a talisman not of guilt but of possibility, proof that good men could die badly and cowards could live well, and that sometimes the distance between tragedy and redemption was measured not in years but in the courage to finally speak truth into darkness. The badge caught the waiting room's harsh light and threw it back, burnished and clean.